What if the genius behind Pet Sounds, one of the greatest albums in music history, didn't actually think some of his legendary peers were all that great? What if Brian Wilson, the heart of the Beach Boys, thought some of rock's most worshipped names were overrated? Because behind the sunshine harmonies and California smiles was a man who silently questioned the very foundation of musical royalty. And once you hear the names, you might never look at your vinyl collection the same way again. For most musicians of the 1960s, hearing the Beatles for the first time was like witnessing a new religion. It was electric. It was revolutionary. But for Brian Wilson, already crafting the rich sonic textures of the Beach Boys, it was a moment of resistance. When Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band hit the airwaves, the world stood still. Critics called it the greatest album ever made. Fans lined up to hear it. Artists everywhere admitted defeat, or at least all. Except Brian. He didn't deny it was good, but he didn't believe the hype. Not completely. At that point, Wilson had just released Pet Sounds, a record that would later be hailed as one of the greatest achievements in pop music. Yet, when Sgt. Pepper arrived, people acted as though it had outdone everything. Brian's work in the public eye was now a stepping stone, just something the Beatles had built on. That's when the resentment started to bloom. He reportedly sat down to listen to Sgt. Pepper in full, and when it ended, he said 5 words that would stick in the minds of those around him. "It's good, but it's there." To Brian, the album felt like a musical play, over-orchestrated, concept-heavy, distant. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the ambition. He just didn't think it carried the emotional weight people were claiming it did. They went broad, he once implied, but not deep. Behind closed doors, Brian told friends he felt the praise was exaggerated, almost as if critics needed the Beatles to be better. Not just than the Beach Boys, but better than everyone. And that irked him, because Brian wasn't trying to win in a popularity contest. He was trying to write songs that hurt, that bled, that told the truth. When he made God Only Knows, he wasn't thinking about charts. He was thinking about death, love, fragility. Sgt. Pepper? It was fun. But for Brian, it wasn't sacred. The irony? Paul McCartney was obsessed with Pet Sounds. He said it directly inspired Sgt. Pepper. He even called God Only Knows the most beautiful song ever written. But when the tables turned and the world began praising Pepper above all else, Brian saw it for what it was, a popularity cycle, a media-fueled coronation. So was the Beatles' crown deserved? Brian wouldn't say they didn't earn their fame. He respected their melodies, their inventiveness, their knack for change. But in terms of soul, intimacy, rawness, he didn't think Pepper came close to Pet Sounds. And he hated that few people seemed to notice that difference. But there was more. The emotional weight Brian carried during this time was colossal. His mental health was fraying. The pressure to top the Beatles, to somehow beat Sgt. Pepper, lulled him to shelve Smile, the album he'd been pouring his genius into. That record was meant to change the world. But instead, it was silenced by depression, industry fear, and endless comparisons to Lennon and McCartney. In a way, the Beatles' acclaim broke him. And that's what makes his opinions so complicated. He didn't hate them. He envied the grace they were given, the patience, the unconditional praise, while he, battling inner demons and hallucinations, was criticized for not delivering Smile fast enough. Behind every compliment the press gave the Beatles, Brian felt a jab. Why don't you evolve like them? Why can't you be more psychedelic? Why didn't you save music? So when fans ask if Brian Wilson admired the Beatles, the answer is yes and no. He admired what they stood for, but not what they symbolized to a world that quickly forgot just how far ahead of the curve Brian had once been. In interviews later in life, when asked to rank albums, he'd frequently skip Sgt. Pepper entirely. Not to be cruel, but because he truly believed it was over-celebrated. He once said, "Revolver was tighter. Rubber Soul had better songs. But Pepper? To him, it was spectacle. Gloss. A beautiful frame without enough painting inside." And here's where it gets tragic. In 1966, Pet Sounds had been too weird for the American market. Capitol Records didn't even believe in it. Meanwhile, a year later, the Beatles could release an acid-drenched concept record with sitars and marching bands, and the same critics who panned Wilson were calling Lennon and McCartney geniuses. That stung deeply. But Brian never lashed out publicly. He never made a diss track. He didn't start feuds. He just retreated into silence, into isolation. And in that quiet space, he formed an opinion that few people ever heard. Sgt. Pepper was a good record, but it wasn't truthful. And maybe that's the line that says it all. Because Brian Wilson didn't chase complexity for show. He chased emotion. And in a world drunk on British innovation and kaleidoscopic production, he remained a stubborn American romantic who believed that simplicity could still be radical. So did Brian think the Beatles were untalented? Not at all. But did he think the world had placed them too high above the clouds, ignoring the quiet geniuses like himself? Absolutely. And that's why the Beatles, especially the version of them found on Sgt. Pepper, were one of the 6 legends Brian Wilson thought were overrated. Not because they weren't great, but because everyone forgot they weren't the only ones. If the Beatles were crowned the kings of melody, Bob Dylan was canonized as the poet of the century. Words like genius, visionary, even prophet were thrown around like confetti whenever Dylan picked up a guitar. But in the quiet corners of his soul, Brian Wilson never quite bought into the myth. Dylan was a storm. He changed everything. Folk to electric, protest to poetry, surrealism to scripture. To most, it felt like magic. But to Brian Wilson, it felt like distance, like someone deliberately hiding behind riddles. There's a reason Brian rarely spoke of Dylan. And when he did, the tone was complicated. On the surface, he'd express admiration. He wasn't out to slander anyone. But behind those quiet praises was a recurring shrug, a doubt, a whisper of resistance to the universal worship Dylan received. For Brian, songwriting was an emotional surrender, a brutal honesty. He wrote about fear, about love that suffocates, about the ache of wanting something just out of reach. When he wrote, "I just wasn't made for these times," it was more than a lyric. It was a cry. So when critics compared that kind of vulnerability to Dylan's cryptic lines and dense metaphors, Brian didn't understand it. He once said privately, "I know what he's saying most of the time." And that wasn't an insult. It was confusion. Because Brian was obsessed with meaning. He layered sounds to heighten a feeling. He added sleigh bells not for flair, but because it sounded like longing. Every harmony had to feel right, not just sound cool. And Dylan? Dylan seemed to be doing the opposite, piling on meaning until the heart disappeared beneath it. It wasn't that Brian thought Dylan was talentless. He respected the movement Dylan led. He understood the revolution. But he didn't see the soul. Or rather, he didn't feel it. And it didn't help that, during the peak of Brian's creative life, critics were obsessed with comparing every American songwriter to Dylan. If your lyrics didn't read like beat poetry, if your verses weren't dripping in ambiguity, you were less serious. That annoyed Brian deeply, because he'd given the world some of the most emotionally bare songs in history. Caroline, no, don't talk. Put your head on my shoulder, till I die. And still, the press treated Dylan like he had access to truths no one else did. That kind of hero worship made Brian uncomfortable. There was a moment in 1965 when Capitol Records executives told Brian that the Beach Boys needed to go deeper, that America was falling in love with Dylan and his social commentary. Brian was crushed. He didn't want to write about politics. He wanted to write about pain. But in that moment, he realized that in the eyes of the industry, Dylan had become the gold standard. And from that moment forward, Brian began to see Dylan not just as a peer, but as a ghost he was being forced to chase. A shadow that critics told him he'd never match because he wasn't intellectual enough. But what they didn't realize was that Brian's struggle wasn't with understanding the world, it was with surviving it. Dylan could drop riddles like breadcrumbs through the forest. Brian was stuck in the forest itself, terrified, and singing to stay alive. So yes, Brian thought Dylan was overrated. Not because he lacked talent, but because the world refused to acknowledge the emotional vacuum Dylan sometimes left behind. He once asked a fellow producer, "Do people even feel anything when they hear his songs? Or do they just think they're supposed to?" And that question reveals everything. Because Brian didn't want to be respected. He wanted people to cry. He wanted them to feel what he felt. And Dylan's myth, while powerful, felt to Brian like an intellectual wall. Something designed to be analyzed, not absorbed. Later in life, as the Beach Boys drifted in and out of commercial relevance, Brian watched Dylan win awards, accolades, and eventually a Nobel Prize. And while he never spoke negatively in public, those close to him say he felt bitter, not envious, but misunderstood, because he believed emotion was the highest art. And yet, the world had chosen ambiguity. There's one particularly haunting moment in a 1990s interview where Brian is asked if he ever wanted to work with Dylan. He pauses, then simply says, "I wouldn't know what to do with him." And that wasn't about musical style. That was about connection. Brian didn't believe Dylan would ever strip away the mask, would ever write a line like, "I guess I just wasn't made for these times." Because Dylan was made for his times. He shaped them. But Brian was drowning in them. So when we say Brian Wilson thought Bob Dylan was overrated, it's not about jealousy or competition. It's about philosophy. Brian believed music should break your heart. Dylan believed it should make you think. And in that divide, Brian often felt abandoned. It's also worth noting that Dylan himself admired Brian. He once said Pet Sounds was the most perfect album ever made, but that compliment didn't erase decades of cultural imbalance. Brian was always seen as the genius who went mad. Dylan was the genius who changed the world. But Brian didn't want the world. He just wanted someone to understand why "In My Room" felt like the safest place on earth. And maybe that's why the Dylan myth never sat right with him. Because in a world that cheered for mystery and metaphor, Brian was screaming in plain English, "I'm scared," and nobody listened.